As one of a number of his students here at the conference, I'd like to express what a tremendous role model Anwar Shaikh was for me as a teacher, supervisor, mentor, colleague, and friend. His sincere commitment to his students, and not only his own students, but all the students in the economics department of the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research, where he has taught for, if my calculations are right, over 45 years.
43 years.
43 years. So you're thinking he started when he was 10, I know. His commitment cannot be overstated. He treated everyone with respect and as an equal, and I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Anwar's paper, or talk today, is Effective Demand and Profitability, a synthesis of classical and Keynesian macrodynamics. Please join me in a warm welcome for Anwar Shaikh.
Am I on? I guess you can hear me, right? All right. Thank you so much, Matt. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. In fact, I was here not long ago. Matt reminded me it wasn't a year ago. It was maybe 4 or 5 months ago. This is the book. I'm going to talk briefly about it, but I want to talk about the aspect of the book which I no longer go to the gym. I just talk about the aspect of the book which has to do with the talk for today, which is Keynesian economics and profitability, what I'm calling the classical Keynesian synthesis, which is different from the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. You'll have to forgive me if I make assertions. I have a limited amount of time. We need time for questions and all that. So I believe I can back up most of what I'm saying if you take a look at the book. The book is 1,024 pages after I cut back some chapters, because one of the projects of the book was to address a systematic path from micro to macro, but also dealing with alternate theories of various topics: relative prices, exchange rates, interest rates, stock market prices, growth, effective demand, and deal with the other arguments, neoclassical, Keynesian, post-Keynesian, because those are not the same, Keynesian and post-Keynesian, and the empirical evidence, because it was very important for me to approach this in what I consider to be a classical tradition, which is of dealing with the real object itself, which is capitalism, not what Marx said, Keynes said, Walras said, etc., Marshall. And in that vein, I want to recover the term classical, because I think it has become lost or subordinated to what I call the Oxbridge definition, which is essentially anti-classical. Several people mentioned today about the notion that classical economics involves equilibrium and balance and harmony. None of that is in what I consider to be the proper classical tradition. Certainly you couldn't count Marx in that domain, but I think you couldn't count Smith either. And Ricardo sometimes, but not other times. So when I use the term classical, I mean specifically the core of the argument that one can extract from Smith and Ricardo and Marx, especially, but I also believe in Kalecki and Keynes. And in the book I try to explain why their arguments fit and can be grounded on this other framework. So There are three dimensions to my work. One is the theory of consumption, which I point out, following my own teacher, Gary Becker, that you do not need any reference to utility theory or optimal choice or rational choice or even rational behavior in order to derive the observed laws of microeconomics. Becker showed this in 1963. I've elaborated and modified that, but and that means that it leaves this methodology of treating consumption in terms of constraints, which, as I show, requires only high school algebra really to show that you can derive all these principles, leaves room for us to have a concrete theory of how people behave. And in my opinion, there's really no difference here between post-Keynesian economics and what I'm calling the classical Keynesian synthesis, or indeed behavioral economics when it's taken to be looking at how people behave rather than how to rescue this bizarre and arcane system from which you start of perfect competition and rational choice. And then the second part is the theory of competition, and here to distinguish between imperfect competition, perfect competition, and what I think of as competition as it appeared in the classical tradition, I use the term real competition, because that is a notion of conflictual competition, where firms set prices in competition. They do so with the aim of gaining market share, and the winning firms destroy the losing firms. And that is the old notion of competition that Darwin takes, actually, as Marx points out, and builds into the notion of evolution in his own framework. He takes a classical notion of competition as war, as conflict. And the different domains of that conflict, they also include the conflict between capital and labor, which is the intrinsic part of this process. So, having said that, that's not what I'm talking about today. That's just to give you the background, because that's the ground on which, the third part is the macro, which is what I want to talk about today. Which is the argument I make in the book is that this notion of real competition allows us to dissolve the antinomy between perfect and imperfect competition, because you can explain the phenomena of empirical phenomena that imperfect competition theories seize upon as a natural consequence of the dynamic process of real competition, which includes profit rate equalization, by the way. So I want to instead focus here on four commonalities between what I'm calling the classical Keynesian synthesis and what might be called Keynesian and post-Keynesian economics, and there are differences between these. One is the endogeneity of money. Anyone reading Marx will recognize that he emphasized throughout the idea that money responds to output and prices, not the other way around. And that also he emphasizes throughout that capitalism is fundamentally a monetary economy. And there are many places, Marx can be blamed for not having finished his damn book, and so that people never read volumes 2 or 3, and it's all scattered, and we don't know what else he meant to say. But we know, if you pay attention to the logic of the argument, this comes out very clearly, and I tried to trace it in my book, that capitalism is fundamentally a money economy. I mean, Keynes himself cites Marx's insight, M, C, M prime. M is money, C is commodities, and M prime is the money you make from selling commodities. And the whole point of starting that way is to emphasize that this circuit of capital is fundamentally a monetary circuit. And here then Marx pauses, unfortunately somewhere else, because there's so many bits and pieces, to say, well, of course, the idea of a monetary economy means that it can be broken if people do not, after selling, buy again. And he says, I can't discuss that here because it requires further development, and we know what he means by that. He has to first deal with profitability and crises and interest rates before, and he doesn't get around to that, and Engels has to assemble that. But the logic is extremely clear, and that has been cited and noted by people. So Robert Skidelsky mentioned yesterday the Mills notion that money can break the circuit, but actually Marx also makes this very central to his own argument. So that's number one, the endogeneity of money and the existence of capitalism as a monetary economy. Secondly, the central role of investment. Now, in Keynes, it's trivial that investment is the core of a multiplier relationship because investment then determines the output in corresponding to a particular savings rate at the highest level of abstraction. But in Marx, the equivalent term is accumulation, which is investment over capital, you might say, or the investment share, which is the rate of growth. Because Marx's analysis is intrinsically dynamic and what I call turbulent dynamic analysis. And this is John Robinson's point, one of my mentors, as was just mentioned by Matt, that Keynes talked about the economy in terms of investment, but if you want to do it in a dynamic sense, it has to be the investment share, the rate of accumulation. Now this seems like an algebraic niggle, but it isn't really, because then you move from statics to dynamics intrinsically, and it poses a different set of issues about how we deal with that, which was central to Robinson's work, for instance. The third point is the central role of profitability. Now, I emphasize in the book something which she emphasizes, again, as I'm taking it from her, which is that Keynes always understood investment as determined by the difference between the expected profit rate and the interest rate, what Keynes calls the marginal efficiency of capital minus the interest rate. And John Robinson points out that if you do it in a dynamic framework, then it has to be the rate of growth, which is the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. Marx exactly emphasizes that same point and says it's central to his theory of accumulation that growth depends on the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. Now, Keynes leaves the marginal efficiency of capital kind of hanging in the air, and there are famous debates between Gargnani and John Robinson, and many others have commented on this, on the fact that the focus in the short run leaves this concept of marginal efficiency of capital either in the domain of just expectations and animal spirits, or linked somehow to marginal product of labor. It is not very clear. In the case of Marx, it is very clear. It clearly stated that the profit rate is determined by the wage share, and the wage share is determined by social institutional factors, and I'm going to talk empirically, concretely about that shortly, that relate in the struggle between capital and labor. One way to think of it is that floor by floor in factory and office, workers struggle for a share of value added. That is, they struggle for a wage relative to what's available in value added. And that's another way of saying the struggle devolves into the struggle of the wage share. And from that point of view, the profit rate is central to the growth process. It's central to the understanding of the dynamic, and the expected rate of profit is related to the actual rate of profit. And here I use Soros's idea of reflexivity, that this relationship is not immediate, but if you go far enough away from the fundamentals, as Soros calls them, then you're brought back to the process. And this bringing back is a balancing act. The balancing act is not equilibrium. It's overshooting and undershooting and overshooting and undershooting, so what we call cycles and crises and so on, and bubbles. And again, that's very easy to establish is central to Marx's own notion. And I show in the book many places where he talks about that. So we have three things so far: endogeneity of money and the possibility of the break due to money, the central role of investment, the central role of profitability in investment and accumulation, and the fourth one is the idea that unemployment is normal in capitalism. That is, capitalism has a tendency to create unemployment and maintain it. But the difference here is that Keynes is very much in the what I would call the neoclassical notion that this is a deficiency of some sort that can be corrected by stimulating the economy. And you'll know that there's a different argument in Marx, one which Goodwin formalizes in the famous reserve army of labor predator-prey model. And that's not the only way to do it, but it's a very beautiful way to do it. Where Marx argues that the existence of a pool of unemployed labor is a normal state in the sense that the system returns to creating that pool. And it's not difficult to understand how. We can observe in practice what happens. When employment is tight, then people who are not in the labor force are enticed into the labor force. Traditionally women, in the United States black people, younger people, you can see this in wars and times of tightness. And then when the labor market gets looser, they're ejected again. Somebody has to be ejected. The same thing for immigrants, migrants, imported and exported. Now, one way to think of it is that capitalism has a cell membrane which becomes more porous when it needs the outside elements to come in, and then closes off when it needs to get rid of them. And one can document this everywhere in the capitalist world, the struggle between the permission of entry into the labor market and the expulsion from the labor market. So what I try and show formally, I don't do a lot of math. The reason the book is so big is I do it all in terms of high school algebra. But people have even complained about that. Some linear algebra, yeah. But people have complained about that. There's nothing difficult there in the book. And you can show that you can have a formal treatment of the reproduction of a normal rate of unemployment. I bring this up because I point out in the book that Phelps and Friedman effectively took this idea from Marx. I don't mean they borrowed it from Marx. They took an idea similar, though Friedman undoubtedly would have known about it growing up in New York in the leftist community that he did, and Phelps actually was at the conference. My colleague Kumar Sami, the lookalike, told me that it was a conference where Goodman presented his first reserve only a paper model, his model. So certainly those ideas were around. But anyway, what they did is they took this idea of a persistent unemployment rate and made it into, in Friedman's case especially, not so much in Phelps, the idea that it is due to the intervention and effects of unions and the state. That is not the argument in Marx or Goodman. On the contrary, their argument is that competition produces and maintains a persistent pool of unemployed labor. And I emphasize some of the implications. That the one implication is that you cannot get rid of unemployment by stimulus alone, because it will be reproduced. There's another commonality in the Keynesian and classical tradition, which is the relationship between wages and unemployment. Now, in the whole argument in Marx about reproduction of a labor pool, the argument is that if the labor pool gets tighter, the real wage begins to rise. If it rises relative to productivity, the wage share rises, in which case the profit share falls, in which case the profit rate falls, in which case growth slows down, and the pickup of labor slows down. And also, in that same instance, technical change it speeds up because a higher wage share gives more incentive for displacement of labor, and so the pool is recreated from the internal mechanism. And that's precisely what Goodman formalizes in his model. Well, this commonality in the Keynesian tradition shows up in the Phillips curve. Not the Phillips curve that we see in textbooks, but the original Phillips curve. If you read Phillips, which is a very amazing article, he takes data and smooths it to get rid of business cycles, and then he asks a question: what's the relationship between wages and unemployment? Now he poses the question in a Keynesian way, a way that was Keynesian at the time, which is what is the relationship between the rate of change of money wages and unemployment? Because at that time, when he was doing it, inflation was not the dominant phenomenon, so money wages seemed to be a proxy also, one could argue, for real wages. It pretty much became clear that inflation was a central phenomenon in the post-war period, and so the second appropriate modification of Phillips' question would be, what's the rate of change of real wages relative to unemployment? And if you make the price part expected, then you get the expectation augmented Phillips curve kind of story. But then the third possibility, which is a possibility in Goodman and Marx, and in fact in the classical tradition, which is that the real wage is conditional on the productivity of labor, so that the real wage in India is not going to be the real wage in the US, no matter how hard you fight, because in fact what you're fighting over, which is a division of value added, is different. And so that point of view suggests that what you want to look at is Phillips' question, which is the rate of change of wages now relative to value added, or the wage share relative to unemployment. And in the book I show that you can do this, and then you can explain the collapse of the other two Phillips curves by the stability of this very curve. And to do that, that's what I want to show you now. What you're looking at is a blank screen. And you're looking at next. Whoops, what happened? No. I didn't test this, so it's not, oh, maybe it's this way, sorry. Okay. I was aiming at it myself, which is why I'm not working. On the vertical axis, you have the rate of change of the wage share in the United States over the post-war period. This is the actual data. Smooth by HP filter. Phillips smooths it in a very complicated way, which I also reproduce, but this is easier because you just press a button and the HP filter shows up. So this is the rate of change of the wage share up here. And this is the unemployment intensity. And all it is the unemployment rate adjusted for the duration of unemployment. If you look at the data, which is very important when you're doing anything like this, you see that the duration shoots up, and you need to allow for that. So I do a simple combination of the two, which I explain in the book, which is a measure that I call unemployment intensity. And you're now looking on this side, so this is the bottom part of the Phillips curve, respectively. This is the vertical part, only it's the real change in the wage share. And we're beginning with 1949. And the US economy is coming off the war. So it's at a very high rate, relatively high rate of increase of the wage share. The wage share is increasing at about 1% a year, which means the profit share is decreasing about 1% a year. But that's because of the war. And as you move, it moves down. And we're now, I don't know what, I forgot to count, but anyway, somewhere around here. That's 58, that's 59, 1960. So that's 1960, and now you're entering the period of the great fiscal pumping of the economy in the Vietnam War. And notice what happens. So this is 60, 61, so on, all the way up to the PowerPoint will not allow me to make the arrows go in the other direction. If anybody knows how to make that fix, I've never been able to figure it out. It won't do it. But anyway, you are still going backwards, and now you reach the peak of the Vietnam War. And as that fiscal stimulus dies out, you come back down the same curve. Now, what does that mean? It means that from this point of view of this curve, what the stimulus does is increase employment, reduce unemployment, and that has the effect of initially stimulating the rise in unemployment reduces the rate of change of the wage share. Not the wage share, but the rate of change of the wage share. And then as the stimulus dies out, the rate of the change of the wage share comes back down. So it pumps up the rate of change of the wage share, accelerates it, and then decelerates it. And then you go here, and around this point is what in the mathematical models the economy should stop. But the economy doesn't know that, and it doesn't obviously stop. What happens instead, as it continues shooting past, is you encounter the Reagan-Thatcher period. And the Reagan-Thatcher period is an attack on the structure of the relationship between wages and unemployment, the social structure. We know that. They attack unions, welfare state. So notice what happens then when you begin to hit right around now. You're hitting Reagan. And effectively, when you look at this point by point, what happens is the curve fractures, and then a new relation is established. Now we're in the 1993 period. You get the dot-com boom, up to the top of the dot-com boom. The boom dies out, and you move back down the same curve. And if I do one more, the curve disappears. Yeah, that's it. Okay. So what have you got here? You've got really two very solid curves, which I call the classical curves, in the up to the golden age of labor, and then the attack, Reagan-Thatcher neoliberalism attack, and then the creation of a new curve. Notice that the the stable, the zero wage share change point here is about 9% in the unemployment intensity. It's not the same thing as the unemployment rate because it includes that. But it translates into about 6.5%. And the new curve, who by implication has a lower unemployment rate at the balance point. Now the balance points are mythical because the economy is always moving and lots of other things are happening. But the point is that once you do this, you can explain what happens to the money wage curve by tracking inflation. And I show in the book why the money wage curve works, the Phillips curve works, until about the 1970s and then falls apart because inflation comes in. And given this curve, you can derive the money wage curve and you can derive the real wage Phillips curve. And you can see why both of them cease to work. And yet, this works, and it works in a way that makes sense of the idea of the social determination of wages in relation to profits and unemployment. So, what are the implications? So now I come to the big assertion. Keynesian stimulus policies were absolutely correct to say that you can change the rate of unemployment, you can lower it by stimulating the economy. Fiscal stimulus works, we know that. But then, if the unemployment rate gets recreated, which is the point of opening for Friedman, then you're going to have to stimulate more. And then, as that happens, you run into what John Robinson would call the inflation barrier, because you're stimulating an economy which is now reverting back to its unemployment rate, involuntary unemployment, that's the key point, involuntary unemployment, and you get inflation and unemployment appearing to rise at the same time. And in the book I go through the data, I go through the debates, I go through Friedman and Phelps and the post-Keynesian and Keynesian arguments and so on. For me, and then I'm going to end here, is that this tells us that you have to pay attention to the effect of stimulus on real wages and on the wage share and hence the profit rate, profit share and the profit rate, because they can, in effect, by stimulating the economy, you can slow down, if you cause the profit rate to fall, you can cause the growth rate to fall. So you're effectively gaining something now, but taking it back, so to speak, by a slower growth rate. The last point, in this framework, and I would argue in the Keynesian framework also, it's inherent that if accumulation depends on the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. If the interest rate is determined by market circumstances, I argue in the book, there's a theory of the interest rate you can develop and test empirically, where it's dependent on profitability. But that, one of the striking things about the post-war period is you can see that the interest rate, which follows a certain rule, which is Gibson's law, is related to the price level, not the rate of increase of prices, coming from competition, then deviates from that level, beginning with the point where the central bank begins to drive interest rates down. Now that stimulates the economy in another way, and that's why monetary policy gets the credence it does, because by making as the profit rate is falling, if the interest rate is following the profit rate, or is close to it, then you're getting a slowdown in growth. But if you can make the interest rate fall faster, you're actually increasing the difference between the two, and you're creating a monetary-based boom rather than a fiscal-based boom, or a profitability-based boom. And I argue that you can trace these actually empirically over time. So to return to my original, I would argue that we have, if we pull, so to speak, our traditions of the classical and Keynesian and post-Keynesian traditions, and I said you can explain the post-Keynesian markup phenomena without having to rely on monopoly at all, then we have the foundations of understanding of policy at a concrete level in what was called in one of the early sessions a general foundation, a foundation in which you can deal with many phenomena in a consistent and coherent manner rather than inventing an imperfection for every phenomena that you see. I want to end with a story which I find very moving. I told some people this. I read recently a book about Johannes Kepler called Kepler's Witch. And the witch part is because his mother was accused by her best friend of being a witch, and she was convicted. because the claim was that she walked past the girl in the street, the girl's arm turned black, and the fact that that statement was made was sufficient to convict her. Kepler struggled with all of these, but Kepler had his own problem. He was a Protestant in a Catholic world, and he believed that God put out laws for astronomers to discover. But the trouble is that astronomers were bound by the idea of Aristotle's idea that a circle is a perfect figure, and therefore God would not have had orbits which are different from circles. And so they had to reconcile the empirical evidence piling up over hundreds of years with the idea of a perfect circle. And what they did is they added imperfections. They moved the center of the circle down a little bit, you got a wobble, but they had to then do an imperfection for each planet. And Kepler believed that God would not do that. He believed that God would not have 27 imperfections. So he searched his whole life for some way to unify the empirical evidence and the theory, and lo and behold, God gave him the answer: ellipses. So I would like us to think more elliptically about economic theory. Thank you. Yeah, questions? We have plenty of time. I'm going to repeat your question, if I may, because I noticed when I was in the audience, or give you a microphone, I guess. Yeah, let me repeat it. Yeah. Okay, the question was the fact that data on profitability firms is based on their accounting, and that's notoriously tricky, to put it mildly, put it politely, and not only in the issues of depreciation, but deciding what counts as earnings and all. I don't use company data. I use national income counts data, because they make a real attempt to link depreciation to the actual stock of capital. And so the profit rates I'm looking at, though they can be industry rates, are derived from NIPA data. And there's a substantial and rather difficult to read section in the book about how capital is measured and the implications of that for our concerns, and how interest payments are dealt with in national income accounts. Very nasty stuff. They add numbers here, take numbers out, move them around, and I explain how that's done and why, and how you can adjust for that. But in the end, the NIPA data gives you pretty much a clear pattern, which is a falling profit rate until around the 1980s, and then a stabilization, because what happens there in the 1980s, and that's part of this curve, is that you notice that the rate of change of the wage share moves into the negative territory, which means the wage share is falling now rather than rising. So the profit share is rising, and therefore profit rate, which was previously falling, gets stabilized. And then the interest rate is lowered, and I make a sharp distinction between the profit rate and the interest rate. One of the things I argue that neoclassical theory did in what I consider to be its con job about how capitalism works is to reduce the profit rate to the interest rate. The idea that the interest rate is equal to the profit rate in some kind of ideal perfect world. I make a big distinction between the two, because that distinction appears in the two main sources of my own thinking, which is Keynes and Marx, and they make that point by empirical and concrete reference. So hopefully I avoid that difficulty. Yeah. Oh, very good.
So another thing that happened just before Reagan and Thatcher was the abrupt rise in oil prices, and the World Bank has made some attempt to calculate rents as a share of GDP, and that shot up at that point, which could also affect the wage share. How do you see that working out here?
It's a very good question. I don't address that in the book, but I did spend a lot of time thinking about it when I happened to be living through it. And what struck me very much is that you could see clearly a shock. You could see the shock in the first oil crisis and the second one, but also you didn't find, in my opinion, any long-term consequences because capitalism is very adaptive and it adapted quickly to that. But here's where the role of theory comes into play. What I did mention is in my book I have an alternate explanation of inflation, which is very much grounded in the same argument of profitability. But that explanation is different from the idea that every cost that enters you is just marked up and so that it creates a rise in prices. I argue, in fact, that's not the case empirically. And just to briefly explain the inflation thing, I'm very much struck by the fact that the Keynesian argument is correct in my opinion, and it's the purchasing power which pulls on the economy upward. So that's but it turns out that's exactly the argument Marx makes about the discovery of gold mines. He says, well, what does gold mine do? They cause capitalism to expand. But that leads to a second question, what are the limits to the expansion? And the Keynesian answer, which I think is improperly carried over from neoclassical theory, is that it's a full employment of labor. But if you have labor being refilled by importing Turkish workers or Mexican workers or Colombian workers, then you cannot make that argument. There is an early argument, and this is why I say it's a classical argument. Ricardo, in his corn-corn model, sets up a framework which you can easily see that if you have corn seed, corn wages, and corn output, the difference is the corn surplus, which is the ratio of this to the first two is the profit rate. But how much can you reinvest? Only the corn surplus. So the maximum rate of growth is equal to the rate of profit. That's von Neumann's insight in the von Neumann ray. But I also note that in the schemes of reproduction in Marx, the same logic applies. The rate of growth depends on how much surplus value gets put that in. You cannot put more than the surplus value, hence the rate of growth cannot be greater than the profit rate. So then it occurred to me, well, okay, the relationship between the growth rate of capital and the profit rate is a kind of measure of the utilization of the growth capacity of capitalism. It depends on profitability, but also how much of it you use. And I showed that that can explain inflation in 13 different countries over the post-war period. I do all of this with help of graduate students, of course. The new school provides you with no funding for anything, but it provides you with great graduate students. So we do it the old-fashioned way.
So I want to compliment you on this wonderful presentation, and one of the contributions that it makes is that central to your thesis is that distribution counts not only normatively, but positively, and there's too much in economics that thinks it only counts normatively and not positively, so I want to compliment you on that. And then I have a question. My sense is that your analysis holds the distribution of capital acquisition constant. And my question to you would be, if the distribution of capital acquisition were variable, meaning to say the distribution of capital acquisition became broader, how would that affect, or you need to look at, of course, it's empirical, but how would that in theory affect your analysis?
Can I please clarify what you mean by capital acquisition? You mean the ownership of stocks and bonds by individuals? Or it means...
I'll start by saying that capital in Marx Keynes sense is physical capital. Capital in monetary policy is the ownership of shares of stocks and bonds issued in the acquisition. But most capital is acquired on an accounting basis with the earnings of capital. And an awful lot of it is acquired with borrowed money. And the distribution of capital over time has been pretty constant, so I don't fault you for not taking that into a variable as a variable. But if there are consequences of broadening capital acquisition of the earnings of capital, which applies to credit, then looking only at wage share, that is to say the wage share of national income, but then also the capital share of that national income, if it becomes more broad, would seem to be to play into the same analysis.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question, and I should say that I am working on that now, but I do mention in the book that this issue comes about when we talk about the distribution of income and its impact, the distribution of income by persons. There's two senses in economics about the distribution of income. It's between capital and labor, and then it's the distribution of income among persons, and then that depends on whether you get wage income or property income. That's Piketty's question. And I emphasize the importance of that at the end of the book, that we have to move from one to the other if we're going to explain real phenomena. It's always a question about standing on the ground that you have and moving it forward a step. So since that time, I have published 2 papers, or maybe 3 papers, on inequality. And I just want to say, to me, this is a fascinating issue, because there's some patterns which are so striking that they need more attention. And here's the pattern. We know that Pareto was the original economist who dealt with inequality because he was charged with keeping the tax returns or the income return of large landed estates. In the process, he noticed that they followed a certain pattern, which is what we call the power law. That if you bin them by size, then they follow a certain frequency distribution, which we now call the Pareto law. He thought that applied to all of income distributions, and when we looked at wage, which were not previously tabulated, but once income taxes became general, we tabulated wages, and we saw they did not follow that. So the idea of the Pareto law dropped out, and people came up with other. Then in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a physicist by the name of Viktor Yakovenko came to it from the point of view of physics, and he developed what he calls the two-class income theory of income distribution. And what he said is that there is a different law for wages than there is for property income. In the wage law, he said, is an additive law. I won't get into the details of that. The property income is multiplicative because you get your income of property from the amount of property you have. Whereas income from labor, it depends on how many hours you work. So, but in the property, it's your stock, right, not your flow. And from the physics point of view, he said, look, we know how to deal with this. This is trivial. And so he shows how you mix the two together. You can join the two. So the top part of the curve is the property, and the bottom part is labor income. They overlap exactly where labor has property income, and that changes over time. It's something we need to establish. But what's striking is that the relationship between the two boils down to one variable, and that's the profit share. So, and the degree to which it's financialized. I just have a paper coming out on that, it's on my homepage, about how to explain the changes in the distribution of income in the United States, linking this to the distribution of assets and in labor income, and I show you that it fits the data really well. So it means that we have a simple framework, a consistent framework, which is always my obsession. Consistent framework to explain yet another range of phenomena. And that's called econophysics, by the way, but it's one branch of econophysics.
Anwar? Here?
Yes, sorry, I can.
Thanks for an interesting talk. In terms of these, the dynamics up and down and above and below, so when it's rising and falling, have you got anything that you can, any more detail to offer on, because clearly the rate of change or the level is not just a movement of real wages, but a movement of real wages and productivity.
Real wages relative to productivity.
Yeah, that's what the wage share is. So what's driving, are there sort of that relationship constant when you're moving up, above, or down, or have you got anything more to say on that, and how does that relate to the different periods of fiscal behaviour?
Yes, thank you. That's a very important question for me. What I do is I try to say to myself, how do you formalize the idea that the relation of wages to productivity, or money wages to value added, which comes to the same thing, evolves from social historical struggle. Anybody who knows the history of labor movements, it knows that it was a bitter struggle every step of the way, and it's done point by point. Now, state can step in and help one side, or they did and switch sides, but it's done on the ground. So I developed a very simple framework in which I just say that value added is broken up into wages, value added per worker, wages, and profits per worker. And then I try to explain what determines wages, or the wage share in this context, which I argue comes essentially from social, historical, institutional mechanisms and the degree to which the wage is subject to unemployment, which even with a given golden age of labor, unions and welfare state, unemployment has an impact on that. That means that this part of the curve, by the derivation, represents the social institutional structure, the accord between capital and labor and all of that in different countries. And the movement along it represents the impact of unemployment. Now, because it's a social institutional structure, we can certainly imagine it being shifted downward or upward, depending on a change in that structure. And these structures are all created historically in certain moments, and then typically don't last, by the way, for all that long before something else causes them to mutate. So I see this, I read this as the historical capital labor accord of the post-war period, and then the new structure imposed by neoliberalism. And Reagan and Thatcher move us from one to the other, and they do it all over the world, by the way. And then what happens when you pump up the economy, if the structure is not changed very much by this, then you're moving up and down the curve. You pump it up, then you come back down. Then the same thing here, the dot-com boom, but now you're pumping it up and down on a new curve. So that's my reading of it, and I do that econometrically and more formally also. Not if the struggle is about, well, I do develop, I apologize, I have a much more developed story because you have to develop how unemployment responds to wages and profitability, which I'm kind of skipping here, but this part of the relationship is preserved in that kind of Goodman elaboration of Goodman's model. So you can do that, and I believe that it in fact fits the phenomenon very well. Can we hear?
Sorry, I have a small question.
Somebody else got it.
Yeah. The
Right here.
income distribution. You emphasize profit share and wage share. Could you comment on why you do not speak about the rent share?
Okay, just to, that question is because what I'm calling profits subsumes what are typically rents, because I'm not asking whether the profits are, at this level anyway, deserved or profits due to competition, but I do elsewhere talk about the law of competition and how profit rates are determined and whether or not they're equalized. And I argue they are essentially equalized, but not for everybody. The argument is the following. At an abstract level, if you think of competition in two industries and the profit rate is higher in this industry than not, capital will flow more rapidly with a high profit rate. It will bring it down more rapidly, less rapidly to low, and will be equalized. But of course, at a more concrete level, firms are constantly in real competition, fighting against each other, and they do so not only by fighting against labor and trying to keep it down, but by changing productivity, improving productivity, changing the technology, and that results in a spectrum, in a dynamic sense, a spectrum of firms. Some older, some newer, some older technology, newer technology, and that poses a theoretical problem. If I have a spectrum here and a spectrum there, which is the equalization process going to focus on? And the answer I provide, largely from the business literature, by the way, is that you try to invest in the newest, generally reproducible methods, which they call best practice methods. So the firms that have these are the ones who will be subject to profit rate equalization. The other firms will have positive and negative rents. Negative also, because they're losers too. And so you can trace the rents. I don't do it here, but if you go into more detail by firm, then you should be able to do that. It's not obvious, by the way, that bigger firms have higher profit rates. I do take a database, whatever it's called, a big database, and I have a sample of 100,000 firms, and one of the striking patterns, which it's repeatedly found in business literature, bigger firms have lower profit rates. You would think bigger firms are there in order to get bigger profit rates. But in fact, what you find is that when you adjust for risk, which is the mortality rate of firms, then the profit rates are not very different. Small firms have a variation, big and small profit rates, and they have a high mortality rate. Big firms, in effect, trade that uncertainty of existence for a profit rate, which is actually not functionally different than the. So that raises a set of questions which I don't address further, but they obviously could be developed further. Yeah, Jim.
Okay, this is all, I think, very, very interesting. Keynes did not believe, and I don't believe, that workers could reduce their real wages by cutting their nominal wages. Go to chapter 2 of the General Theory. The argument is laid out very clearly.
Yeah.
And I think what you've got here perhaps has been a little bit seduced by the neoclassical vision of the labor market, in which there's an implicit bargain based upon the strength of labor. Here, you've made the data work out by, I think, multiplying the duration of employment by the rate, which is something which we call the Manchester Index when we invented it at the Joint Economic Committee.
Okay, I need to know that, thank you.
After Paul Manchester was our statistician.
Okay.
I don't think that gives you an indicator of the strength of labor in wage negotiations, because the duration of unemployment does not add to the bargaining power of capital, it seems to me. Another point to make here is that your crossover point is 1977, which is well before 4 years before Reagan takes office. And the Reagan effects start coming in 1981 and only go in the same direction for a couple of years before you start moving back along your curve toward what ultimately turns out to be the boom of 1999. So what I want to suggest that may be going on here is a third factor, which is influencing both of your variables. And that factor has already been mentioned by several questions, which is the rising share of resource rents. In 1949 and in the early 50s, this share is extraordinarily low because the U.S. is riding on a pool of world resources which should basically be available at a historically low cost. But that cost advantage erodes over time consistently, as you see in your data. The erosion accelerates in the 1970s. It accelerates again through 2007. And that would be sufficient to both reduce the wage share and eventually move it into negative territory, and throw a lot of people out of work and leave them out of work, thereby explaining the employment intensity. So I just want to suggest that you might be looking at something which is not determined in the labor market, but in the let's say, in the declining advantage of the United States and its command over resources over this period. And for that reason, something's going to continue to get worse as the advantage continues to deteriorate.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of points there. Let me make first general point, which is that I argued throughout the book that prices are not determined by wages or input costs. That's not to say they can't be affected by that, but that's relative pricing. The price level is not determined by that. So that's what I meant to say, that you have to have a different theory of inflation. If you have a markup theory of inflation, then if you put oil, resource costs, or wage costs higher, then the price level rises. But I argue very fervently against that argument. And I can't reproduce that immediately here, but that means, among other things, that a fall in money wages is a fall in real wages, by and large, because money wages and prices are not linked in that sense. And I think that Keynes correctly argues that there are reasons. I read Keynes differently. Keynes is basically worried about and trying to defend against the argument that a fall in money wages is a fall in real wages. But the neoclassical argument says that the unemployment rate will reduce itself because workers will become cheaper and they pick it up. So I think he does it by trying to break that link. But I think that's a wrong link to break. Marx argues exactly the opposite, from observation, by the way, that fall in real wages that fall in money wages leads to a fall in real wages. And the whole reserve army of labor is built on that one-to-one connection. And I think that's the correct connection. And I try to establish that. So then the question is, do things like the duration, I like the Manchester Index is a better name than mine, so I'll definitely use that. Does duration affect the bargaining power of capital? I think it absolutely does. Even notions like the cost of job loss, which is a way of picking up this idea, say that if you think you're going to be unemployed for 2.5 years, you're much more reluctant to risk it, and moreover, the other side is much more able to provoke it. In the literature that I could see, I think this duration thing, by the way, comes out from globalization. I think it comes away from the idea that firms are moving abroad, which may or may not be resource motivated. They're moving abroad, and therefore they're leaving behind a pool of people who can't even get back into the game. And I've looked at some of that literature, though admittedly I didn't address that in the book, but it's something that certainly should be addressed. Where is this increased duration coming from, and how is it affecting the bargaining condition? And I confess I did not do that. It's a very good point, and I would definitely like to see that. It may be that you want to introduce that element in here. I did only minimal econometrics. I did Phillips econometrics in order to show it's the same. But one can certainly do that and see if you pick it up. I'm not a competition, so that means I'm looking for a graduate student who can do this.
Anwar, there's something interesting about that curve, and that is the year 1999. Now that's not tax credit, it's not trading.
1999, yeah.
Your whole curve slope becomes quite different. Now what happened in just before 1999 or 1999? What was the difference? What happened there to change this thing? And let me throw out one thing that I know happened in 1999, and that was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act and profits becoming much larger in the financial industry. I had Simon Cousins as a staff professor when I was at Penn, and Simon always had GDP as a measure of manufacturing, where you knocked out units. And we always used to ask him, well, what happens when service? What's a unit of service in the finance industry? And he really didn't answer it. Isn't that 1999, if you look at it, profits are moving away from manufacturing in the United States, certainly, towards the finance. And why 1999 as opposed to 1960 or something like that?
I hadn't thought of that, and I need to think about this. My reading of this was that what you're getting here is a classic stimulus due to the dot-com boom, which has been cited many, many times as a very stimulative thing. And I hadn't thought about why it stops in 1999. But obviously, what causes the concrete factor, which I hadn't even thought about the Glass-Steagall Act as a possible source of killing off the boom and then moving it back down the curve. I certainly, if I ever get to do a second edition, I will certainly put that in. I will look at it more carefully.
And look where the profit share in the financial industry is relative to whatever manufacturing and agriculture we still have.
I will do that. Thank you.
That was very interesting. I have a quick question on this chart. So, in usual presentations of the Phillips curve, people talk about inflation or unemployment, and there's a sort of trade-off there because inflation is bad and unemployment is bad. So you have either one bad thing or the other bad thing. But I don't see a trade-off here because you have either high wage rate or employment, which is one is good, the other one's bad. Unless you want to say that high wage rate is bad and unemployment is bad. And that's sort of some part of the argument that we get now from the mainstream, that, high wage rate is high unit labor costs, which is low productivity and all that stuff. But I don't see a trade-off in this curve. I just see, a slide towards the bad, and that's it.
Well, let me just explain what the curve is, because it's confusing and I skipped over. The original Phillips curve was a relationship between money, wages, and unemployment, not prices. There were no prices in Phillips. Read the original article. What happened is that the Keynesians needed to know if they reduced unemployment, what would happen to prices. And Phillips was no help unless you added onto the Phillips curve on markup models, which is basically what happened. So then they replaced the rate of change of wages with the rate of change of prices on the implicit assumption of the stability of markups. And that became the original post-war Phillips curve, but it's not the curve that appears in Phillips. I don't do that because I don't believe in markup pricing. I don't think it's a valid way to go to explain the price level. And I don't think markups are stable anyway, but they can be explained by competitive processes. So if that's the case, then I don't have an inflation-unemployment trade-off this way. But elsewhere in the book, I make the connection between these two by saying, look, if profitability is decreased, then the maximum growth rate is coming down. If you're pumping up the economy, you're actually keeping the actual growth rate from coming down. You're actually keeping it up or maybe raising it. So you're closing the gap between the two, and you're approaching inflationary potential. And what we do is we develop a simple formal model of what I call the push-pull. The pull is aggregate demand, the growth of aggregate demand, and the resistance is the capacity of the economy to grow as it approaches the maximum growth rate, something which Passanetti discusses in talking about the maximum growth rate. And we argue that you can actually explain inflation in many countries and many different time periods with these two variables as the primary variables. Now, undoubtedly, I'm not an econometrician, so I often use graphs and charts to do it, and we do some econometrics. But you could make it more sophisticated, but I like the logic of this because it fits very well with the argument which I'm making, which is the core of the classical idea, which is that profitability plays a very central role in many, many phenomena. I haven't talked to you about exchange rates, which I derive from the same principle, or the stock price, or Shiller's argument, which I argue can be explained in an entirely different way, following the same principles. My goal is to show that a small set of principles would explain a large set of phenomena. So I'm constrained a little bit that way, but so far it's proven to be fairly fruitful over 25 years.
Yeah, let me suggest that there might be another phenomenon that we should take into consideration, and from that 1993 to 99 rise and then the fall. This is during the Clinton administration, and we have a tremendous increase in credit card debt that begins in that period and is at its peak in around 1999, and then begins to fall. And I'm thinking about that in light of Keynes' argument about the rate of the increase in aggregate demand being related to the increase in personal debt.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point. Again, one of the many things I didn't think of, obviously, because the main thing I was thinking of was that this, from the logic of the argument, the movement up a curve against the grain, so to speak, is a pumping of the economy, though the natural movement may be one way or the other, and I developed that at a more detailed level. But this seemed to me pretty clearly pumping, and I attached the name the dot-com bubble. But you're absolutely right, it was a period of expansion of purchasing power in general, and that's consistent with the idea that it moves you up the curve. Now what's happening here though? You're in a space where the rate of change in the wage share is falling. That doesn't mean wages are falling, real wages. They're falling relative to productivity, so it's slowing down relative to productivity. And this reduces that slowdown of wages relative to productivity, but it's still in the negative part. And then, as that stimulus dies out, you go down this way. And here it's because of a variety of factors, and I confess I have not developed a detailed model of why it moves along that curve, but it's clear here that you're entering the period of the dominance of neoliberal capitalism. Moving abroad, unions have been smashed, the state has, the fiscal policies of the state have been constrained or eliminated, and so you are basically moving down in a kind of Keynesian heat death. Yes, it does. Each arrow represents a year.
And so I'm intrigued by why there is no effect in this curve of the financial crisis of 2008.
Very good question. But remember, the curve itself is not dependent on the financial crisis, dependent on the fall off of stimulus. And if there, and you can see it sort of decline here. Remember, the curve is annual, so I don't have the data in between. But I would argue that the effect of that is to move you sharply in this direction. The movement itself is an effect of is a reflection of the stimulus because you're moving in this direction. It doesn't take you off the curve, it moves you along the curve. And so one needs to elaborate more why the curve moves in one direction or another, and I didn't do that. I wanted to first establish that there's something to talk about. I do develop a more formal model, which would allow for that, but I didn't estimate it or anything. I'm always a little uneasy about estimation because anybody who's done econometrics knows that you can produce a different result, and so I like to see the question in a form that's not dependent on that before I start. This curve is meant to not show that because it's meant to show a structural relationship. And I think what I'm seeing in this curve is that we are still moving now. My data ends in 2011. The book,
That's my question. Have you looked at for 5 years beyond that?
I haven't updated it, but let me say that I have a book website where all the data is available and one can easily update it. I was finishing something else when the book was coming to press 2 or 3 years ago. And I wanted all my data to cover the same time period. And so I couldn't just go back and do all of them to 2015, but I don't know the answer. It would be a very good question. And it could be easily done. The website is called realecon.org. It has the book, reviews, critiques, errata, which are rapidly a number, and all the data, as well as suggestions on how to modify it and elaborate on it and so on. And I welcome comments on there. We're trying to get a sense of how to use it. And I'm also particularly interested, how can you use this book in teaching? The book is too difficult for that, but could we simplify it? Could we do another version, the textbook? I don't know the answer to any of that yet. But I'm looking for questions and answers.
All right, I think if there's one more question, we can maybe do one more, but we need to get back over for the panel at 2 o'clock. So I guess if I don't see any hands, we'll go ahead and round things up and thank